Hi everyone, and welcome back to Argo Prep's unit of study for the SHSAT. Today, we're going to start talking about some of the new information that's been added to the recent versions of the SHSAT English Language Arts section. Today, we're going to start by discussing infographics. Our objective for this lesson is that by the end of it, you'll be able to identify and interpret the different kinds of infographics that might appear on the SHSAT. So let's start with a little good news, especially for people who aren't necessarily English people or don't consider themselves students who are especially strong in English language arts. And that's that the introduction of these infographics on the SHSAT, it actually helps you draw on some other skills, some sort of basic math skills that you probably developed in elementary school. So again, if you're more of a math person, the addition of these infographics is really great news. Because it'll help you use some other skills that you prefer if you're someone who's more math-oriented, to help you shore up your score in ELA. So let's start by just kind of talking about infographics generally. Let's establish an understanding of what they are. So we'll start by saying an infographic is just a blanket term that it means any number of visual representations of data or information. Another way to say that is it's using a picture or a chart rather than sentences and paragraphs to communicate information. Usually they're going to contain data. A lot of times it could be numbers. Other times it could be words and phrases. But it's going to be organized in some sort of chart or table or other visual representation. So where are you going to see the infographics? They might be attached to some of those informational texts you're going to encounter. So they're not going to be attached to any fiction or any poetry or anything like that, but definitely those non-fiction passages on the SHSAT in the reading comp section might have an infographic accompanying it. More good news here is that infographics just by nature are pretty much straightforward. That's the whole idea. The reason people use infographics is to present information in a way that's really easy to understand. So as long as you know what you're looking at and know how to interpret them, you'll do great. And that's what we're going to use time for in this lesson. We're just going to kind of build some familiarity or really remind you about the kinds of infographics that you're going to see. Because like I said before, you should already have some familiarity with these from your math class. Okay, so let's chat a little bit about different kinds of infographics that you might run into. So the first one that you're going to run into probably most frequently is just a data table. That's an infographic that organizes data, obviously important information, into columns and rows. If you're a little shaky on columns and rows, don't worry, it's a really common misunderstanding, even among a lot of adults. And in just a couple of minutes, we'll really clarify it, and I'll show you a little trick to help you remember which is which at all times. So like I was alluding to before, the data in a data table, it might be represented as numbers, or there might be words in there. Like sometimes you'll see they'll be describing something and there will be certain qualities and they'll just be saying like, does it have this quality? So like, is it red? Yes or no? Is it bigger than a car? Yes or no? Etc., etc. Other times though, it might be like, what was the temperature on Monday? 57. What was the temperature on Tuesday? 73. So there's all kinds of different information that you can contain in that data table, and you can represent it a lot of different ways, but regardless, you interpret it the same way by analyzing the columns and the rows. Okay, the next infographic you're likely to see is a pie chart. A pie chart is an infographic that uses the area of a circle to represent percentages. So you're almost always talking about like demographics, like what percentage of people feel a certain way, like what percentage of the people in the class speak English, what percentage of people in the class speak Spanish, what percentage of the people in the class speak French, etc., etc. So since the data is represented in percentages, it should always add up to 100%, because in spite of people saying you should give 110% all the time, right, there's no such thing. So one of the good things to remember is when you're dealing with a pie chart, all the numbers in there should add up to 100%. So when are you most likely to see pie charts? A lot of times in social studies or social sciences, like I said, where they're talking about demographics, different kinds of people. A lot of times they'll use a pie chart to show you the result of a survey or a census and so on and so forth. So it's a way to represent percentages and just with a quick glance really kind of give people a sense of how something breaks down. Again, we'll do a little kind of close-up on this in just a minute and look at a pie chart and talk more specifically about how to approach it visually. We're just taking a second right now to define these different infographics. The next one you're pretty likely to see is a line graph. A line graph is, as the name suggests, An infographic that uses a rising and falling line to show fluctuations in something over time. And the data, each data point is like one place on the line. You'll see when we look at the visual example in just a few minutes. Line graphs are used a lot in business or in economics. I mean, science as well, but in everyday life, I would say mostly in business, to show performance over time. So like if you were showing how many sales a given business made each month, a line graph would be a really good example. Actually, that's the one we're going to look at in just a few seconds. Or on the scientific end, if you wanted to show, temperature fluctuations from month to month, you could also use a line graph so that, in months where the temperatures were colder, the line would go down, and in months in there the temperatures are hotter, the line goes up. Once again, these are probably concepts you're pretty familiar with, from things you've already seen in math and science. We're just teasing them out here because it's a little different to apply them to English language arts. It's a different mindset and a different tool set, and we want to make sure we're fully developed before we head into the SHSAT. Okay, the final one of the big four that we're going to chat about in this lesson would be bar graphs. Bar graphs are infographics that use bars, as the name suggests, right, of varying heights to compare quantities and amount. So what that means is that data is represented as the height of a different bar measured against reference points. So like a taller bar, a taller tower, literally means bigger numbers. Bar graphs are really, really highly visual, which is great. They're often used to make direct visual comparisons of quantities easier. So like if you wanted to tally up votes or something like that, if you wanted to show someone the results really easy, it might be nice to use a bar graph because then they could clearly see like, oh look, this is the tallest bar. That means this is the person who won the election because they had the most votes. Again, infographics are all about taking data and just making it as easy to understand as possible. Okay, so those are the different infographics you're going to see. Let's take a second to look at what kind of questions you might be getting asked about those infographics. So on the SHSAT, you might need to identify or fetch a particular data point from the graphic. So that's like a basic comprehension question. They might just ask you to look at the table and answer a question just based on factually interpreting it. Meaning there's a clear right or wrong answer. You don't need to do any analysis or interpretation. You're just finding a particular data point that they ask for. So that's one thing that you need to be ready for. So if they ask what was the temperature on Tuesday based on the graph? Or how many cars did this car lot sell in the month of April based on the graph? Whatever, things like that. Just being able to look at the graphic, correctly interpret it, and find data accordingly. That's a big part of what you'll need to do. That's not it though. There's other skills as well. You need to be able to recognize trends and determine major takeaways. That's a lot like understanding the theme or the main idea of a passage, right? So the idea here is that, you're not just finding certain things that it tells you outright, like we talked about in the first bullet point. This is more applying some of your own thinking. So if they gave you a chart with sales, they might ask you is this company generally doing better or doing worse in recent months? So you have to see okay, are the trends, or do they show that the sales are going up because that's a positive trend, or do they show that the sales are going down because that's a negative trend? So that's, one level of analysis you're going to need to do. But the good news is that all of these different kinds of infographics are designed to make these kind of determinations really, really easy and really, really visual. So as long as you know what you're looking at, you should be able to answer these ones relatively easy with just a little logic. Now this is a little tricky, a little more nuanced, a little more high concept. They also might ask you why that style of infographic is well suited for the information contained in it. So for example, they might ask you, why did they use a pie chart to go with this particular passage? And then let's say the passage was about, let's say people of different language groups, like we talked about before, people of different primary languages, different percentages. And you could say, well, a pie chart's the right choice there because they're talking about percentages, they're talking about the makeup of a population that adds up to 100%, and a pie chart makes that really easy to understand. On the other hand, if they were presenting scientific results or an experiment, well then if it was in a data table, you could say, okay, it's in a data table because it makes understanding the different times they did the experiment over and over more understandable. You can sort the data out really easily. So like I said, this is where you're starting to get into some higher level thinking, really understanding not just what's in the infographic, but why they chose that kind of infographic. They also might ask you just generally to kind of summarize the main ideas of the graphic. And like I was saying before, your math skills will probably make this pretty easy. They'll just ask you, generally, what is the graphic saying, or what's the main idea of this graphic? And it's basically just like providing a summary of a paragraph. Just, look at it and try to break it down to one little simple sentence or basic statement. What is really this chart all about? If you rely on those math skills and the skills that we'll talk about in the next few slides, this kind of thing will be really, really easy. You may need to also compare information from the infographic to information from the text passage. And that's not something we're going to focus on this lesson. We're actually going to do a whole lesson on that next time. So for the rest of this lesson, we're just going to focus on looking at each of those different kinds of data tables or infographics one at a time, and we're going to sort of look at how to break them down and analyze them visually. So let's start with that first one, the data table. Here's an example of a data table. It says Jessica's cell phone usage for the summer. On the left side, we have some organized information. It says local phone calls, long distance calls, texts, and data usage. And then up on the top, we see the months of June, July, and August. These are really important labels that tell us what's going on. Because remember, you might need to summarize what this is explaining. So even before we dive in, we can kind of see that generally it's showing how much Jessica used her cell phone over this 3-month span, and it's providing some different data. It's quantifying the numbers of calls, showing how many texts, and also giving us the total amount of data she used. So now that we've just kind of generally looked at, what the table looks like and what kind of information we're seeing, let's introduce ourselves to some really important terminology that you might need when you're answering questions about data tables. You need to know that the data table is organized into rows and columns, right? We talked about that before. So they might ask you, what information is in the third row? In order to answer that correctly, you need to remember that rows are horizontal. So these are the rows that go across here. So one row is local phone calls, one row is long distance calls, one row is texts, and one row is data usage in megabytes. So I told you before I had a good trick to remembering which are the columns and which are the rows, because that's a mistake a lot of people make, like I said, including a lot of adults. Well, my secret is that rows go from left to right. So I remember that R in row is the same as the R in right. That's a really valuable tip. Of course, that also means that these guys are the columns, the ones that go vertically. So here we have this kind of leftmost column, and that just contains the labels for the rows, where it says long distance, local, text, data, etc., etc. But all the other ones have important headings that tell us what information is below. So we know that everything under June represents information for the month of June. Everything in the column under July represents information for the month of July. Everything under August represents information for the month of August. So like I said, this is just drawing on some pretty basic math skills that I'm sure you already have. But it's really important to remember the terminology of rows and columns, because they might ask you, what do the labels in the rows tell us about the kind of data that's in the table? Or what do the labels in the columns, how are they helpful? They might ask those kind of questions about the structure of the table, so you need to know what they're talking about. So that's a general intro to the data table. Let's talk next about the pie chart. So here's an example of a pie chart. Like we talked about before, it's in a circle, and we can see that it represents percentages, and if you took a minute to do the math here, you would in fact see that they all add up to 100%. So let's see. This pie chart has a really clear title right at the top. And remember, it's always really important to start with the title whenever you have one, right? Same with a book, same with an article, etc., etc. So we know this pie chart is about how do Computersoft employees get to work. So we have this company, and this chart is representing how different percentages of people get to work. We see these different colored segments with percentages, and then down below we have a key or a legend that tells us how to interpret the pie chart. So we need to interpret that and the numbers and the title to get really a full picture of what is going on. So anytime you see a pie chart, you need to remember to analyze the title, so you know what the chart's expressing, the key and the legend, so you know what each segment represents, and the numbers in the chart, so you actually understand what's being quantified, what the actual numbers are. So let's do a little practice here. So based on this chart, how many people, or how many different ways do people get to work at Computersoft? Or at least how many different ways did they ask people about in the survey that they did before they created this pie chart? Well, we just need to look at how many different segments are there, right? So if we start at the top and move clockwise, there's the red one that says 9%, that's 1. The blue one, 2. The green one, 3. The yellow one, 4. The orange one, 5. So where there were 5 different modes of transportation that they accounted for that people at Computersoft take to get to work. So that's just one example of really simple baseline analysis that you can do on a pie chart. You can also just quickly figure out, just visually by looking, which one is the most popular. That's easy to tell because it's just the biggest segment of the pie, right? We can clearly see that most of this chart is blue. Therefore, we know that car alone, so just riding in a car by themselves, is how most Computersoft employees get to work. We can then also see just visually that biking or walking with only 9% is the least popular, and the train, carpool, and bus are all about equal. And we haven't even dove into the numbers specifically or looked at the passage this is connected to. We're just using the natural visual organization of the chart to interpret it. And that's what you really need to do when you're interpreting infographics on the SHSAT. So here, next up, let's look at the line graph. So we see, once again, let's start with the title. This is showing us cars sold at Ron's Big Value Lot per month. Fantastic. And then we see a line that goes up and down, and like we said, each one of these circles is a point, is one measurement of data. And we can see that we have a trend where they started off kind of low, and then they went up, and then they went back down. So we didn't even attach any numbers to that yet, we just kind of generally summarized or described it, and that's a skill that you really need to have. So let's talk about the labeling here, just like we did with the data table with the columns and the rows. So you see down at the bottom where the red line is, where it gives the different months of the year? That horizontal line is known as the x-axis. So that information with the months is on the x-axis. The vertical line on the left-hand side with all the numbers that goes up and down, that's called the y-axis, and it's the vertical line. So like if they asked you in a question, what does the information on the x-axis represent? You could say, okay, the information on the x-axis tells the reader which month of the year that the data point above corresponds to. If they asked you what's the y-axis all about, you could say the y tells you how many cars they sold that month. So let's dive in for just a second more. Let's see what else can we just generally interpret quickly here. So what was their best month? In which month did they sell the most cars? It was July, right? Because you can just look at the line, where's the highest point on the line, and then you look down on the x-axis to the corresponding spot, and that's right above July. So which was their worst month? It was April, right? Because that was the lowest point on the line. Now September is pretty close as well, even though it's at the far end of the line. But we can just see visually, low points mean low numbers, high points mean high numbers. Okay, that's the line graph. Like I said, probably not a lot of new information, but that x-axis, y-axis terminology is really important. Now finally, we're going to round out our set here by talking about bar graphs. So again, we've got a title, annual robberies in 2 neighboring towns, and then we have these bars. At the bottom, on that x-axis, we have some years. On the vertical side, on the y-axis, we have some numbers, which must be telling us how many robberies happened in those years. Now we also have 2 sets of bars, a blue bar and a green bar. So we need to look down at the legend or key that's below, and we can see that the blue bar represents robberies in Daveston, and the green bar represents robberies in Salisbury. So when you look at a bar graph, remember, just like I just did, you need to analyze the title, so you know what's going on. You need to analyze the key or legend, so you know what each bar represents. And you need to look at the labeling of the axes, the x and y axis, so you can know what they are telling you. So let's just look, generally, which town had more robberies? Salisbury, right? Because in each comparison, in each set of bars, the green bar is always higher. And remember, if we know what the y-axis is, it's telling us this number of robberies. So taller bar, more robberies. We can see here that Salisbury always had more robberies. Okay, I just introduced a ton of new information, so let's review. So some SHSAT informational reading comp passages might have accompanying infographics, and we define an infographic of just a visual way of quantifying or representing data. When you're breaking down infographics, no matter which form they take, it's really crucial that you understand both what is the information that's being presented and what the format and style is. Because like I said before, they might ask you, like, why is it good that they use this kind of infographic? Why would they choose to use a data table? Why would they choose to use a line graph? So you need to be able to quickly interpret what's the infographic telling you, and why did they choose that kind of infographic. Specifically, you should be ready to interpret the 4 types we talked about: data tables, pie charts, line graphs, and bar graphs as well. We're going to get some more practice with those in our very next lesson, because next time we're going to chat about how to connect an infographic to the actual passage that it comes with. All right, see you then.